This is the third of three lectures on Heidegger. The first was entitled Heidegger, Dasein and the Question. The second was entitled Heidegger and Truth. And this final lecture on Heidegger will address questions. It's entitled Heidegger, Spirit, and Fascism. It will examine Heidegger's statements, texts regarding the concept of spirit in Heidegger, and how it how he became involved with the fascist movement. We'll look at some of those historical facts, and we're also going to just take a brief moment and look at what fascism is. So many times, we just say, "Oh, so and so's a fascist," or these words get thrown around. We don't even know what we're talking about. So we want to be very careful about these definitions. Now, one of the things that we're going to see is that, spirit, Derrida has a whole book on spirit in Heidegger. It's called Of Spirit, Heidegger and the Question. We're not going to go into that. But I will just say very quickly that it's worth looking at. And one of the observations that Derrida is going to make, remember, Derrida, although influenced by Heidegger, is Jewish, Sephardic Jew from Algeria. And being, Jewish and knowing Heidegger's complicity with the Nazis, this has been an issue that Derrida had to wrestle with throughout his career. For instance, in the controversies at Yale, when his colleague Paul Deman was found to have written this terrible, slop that was published in Belgian journalism, the anti-Semitic, rantings. And then, became one of the main figures in Deconstruction. All of this material emerged after his death, and Derrida was close to him in a personal way. And in Heidegger, it's more of an intellectual kinship. But what do you do with this? If you're Jewish, what do you do with this? How do you respond to this aspect of Heidegger? And I think it's interesting to note that Derrida observes that, that when he does this really careful look at the question of spirit in Heidegger, one of the points that he makes is that Heidegger really carefully, when he thinks about spirit, he brackets off the thinking of spirit in the history of Western philosophy that is clearly indebted to more Abrahamic conceptions of the spirits. But he doesn't want to go there. He doesn't want to think spirit in those terms. But how can you investigate, the history of spirit in Western philosophy without considering this enormous question? After all, the Holy Spirit, for instance, is one of the parts of the Godhead in the doctrine of the Trinity in the Christian tradition. So it's a place you can go for further reading. It's called Of Spirit, Heidegger and the Question by Derrida. I think there are problems with Derrida's take on that. There's aspects of this question of the history of the concept of the spirit that he's oblivious to as well. We won't get into that, but we're going to focus really carefully on this question of what is spirit, and how is this concept also linked to fascist ideology, which we will explore. So I've entitled the essay. There you can see, at his most sort of disgraceful moment, Heidegger wearing the uniform of the Nazis. He was reputed, when his friends couldn't believe that he had gone down, had become a supporter of Hitler, and they questioned him, and he was reputed to have said something like, "Well, look at Hitler's hands! What magnificent hands!" I mean, just this was Heidegger's bêtise, and it raises the question, what does it mean? How does this compromise? How does this jeopardize his thought? What do we do with this very problematic history? But I do want to, as a cautionary note, while we want to be very frank and forthright about his complicity with fascism, with the Third Reich, you always have to be very careful. Like, history, philosophy, at least if you're Plato, philosophy begins with the putting of a philosopher on trial, and it didn't really go very well in retrospect for those who put the Socrates on trial. And so while we put, we want to be careful about putting Heidegger on trial, and we certainly don't want to put philosophy itself on trial, have our critique of this aspect of Heidegger's thought degenerate into kind of a mere ad hominem attack. And so it doesn't, all of us do things in our lives that we're sometimes, that we're not particularly proud of. That's part of being alive. But does it really mean does the question that we have to ask ourselves is, does his praxis, to put it in Marxian terms, is it a direct consequence of his philosophy? We're going to see there are aspects of this where there certainly a case can be made that this is the case. But I also we'll return to this when we read. We're going to look at Derrida's wonderful little book entitled "The Ear of the Other," where he examines this question as well. And we'll see what Derrida does with it. Okay. Here are some historical considerations. It's in May 1933 that Heidegger joins the Nazi Party. Not long afterwards, he becomes the rector of the University of Freiburg, and really, is reputed to have treated some of his friends, like Herschel, for instance, who was his mentor and to whom he dedicated being in time in very problematic ways. Dismissing, for instance, many of the feeling that there were too many philosophers. There didn't need to be that many philosophers. That if he was enough himself, I guess. But it was in 1934 that Heidegger stopped attending Nazi meetings, and he was, the Nazi Party viewed him, as somewhat of a heretical in his orientation to National Socialism in Germany. So there was always a kind of a disconnect between the thinking of Heidegger and the official ideology of the Nazis. But it came to a head, and about a year later, and about the same year, he also resigned as a rector. But he remained a member of the Nazi Party until 1945, and this would become decisive fact in his later being banned from teaching. He was banned he was not allowed to teach in Germany until 1951. It was in 1946, as you can see here, that he wrote his letter on humanism in response to Jean-Paul Sartre, some of the questions Jean-Paul Sartre had about his philosophy and his possible Marxian appropriation of his philosophy, which, as we already said, Heidegger firmly rejected. Okay. All right. So here is a quote from a talk that Heidegger gave, a very controversial talk that he gave when he became rector at Freiburg, called "The Self-Assertion of the German University." And we see here places in his thought where Heideggerian thought conjoins with the thinking of the National Socialists in Germany. Here's Heidegger. This speech remains a kind of a scandal in his corpus of writing, along with his black notebooks. "The will to the essence of the German university," he says, "is the will to science as will to the historical spiritual mission of the German people as a people, or a folk, or a Volk, that knows itself in its state. Together, science and German destiny must come to power in the will to essence. And they will do so, and only will do so, if we, teachers and students, on the one hand, expose science and to its innermost necessity, and on the other hand, are able to stand our ground while German destiny is in its most extreme distress." Okay. So you're going to see this notion that we'll find also in Introduction to Metaphysics, this description of Germany being caught in the pincers, between sort of Soviet socialist Marxism in the Soviet Union on the one side, and then the perceived threat of liberal liberalism on the other side, liberal democracy in Europe, in Western Europe, and in the United States, and France, for instance. And so, and we'll see later when we look at the thinking of Carl Schmitt that that there is a kind of a cavalier, and also we'll look at some of this in some of the fascist texts we're going to look at today in this lecture, a real cavalier hostility towards liberalism. It's going to be, Carl Schmitt's going to say very famously that a liberal is somebody that, when asked to choose between Christ and Barabbas, the prisoner who was set free before Christ was crucified, the liberal is someone who will, when faced with this choice, will call a committee meeting in order to avoid conflict. So it's kind of funny, but we'll return to this kind of hostility to liberalism that we find in the thinking of Schmitt as well. Okay, the spiritual world of a people is not the superstructure of a culture any more than it is an armory filled with useful information and values. The spiritual world of a people is the power that most deeply preserves the people's earth and blood-bound strengths as the power that most deeply arouses and most profoundly shakes the people's existence. Now, this is scandalous. When you look, I've put in italics here the reference to the blood-bound strengths. All right, that's Hitler, who was a lunatic. If you read Mein Kampf, which is a very difficult text to read, not because it's conceptually difficult. Hitler was not particularly bright. But because it's like looking up vomit. It's just like lunatic raving and ranting, and I'm gonna show you a passage from it later, but no more than a passage, because I don't want to do more than that. But I'm doing it. I want to show you this to draw attention to this theme of blood, because Hitler's whole worldview is about blood. And the blood of a particular people, kind of a mystical blood claims. And so, when you see, I'm not aware of any other place in Heidegger's corpus, except for this terrible speech where he goes there, in effect, and makes this reference to blood. So, anyway, something to consider. Okay. Now, here is Heidegger in 1953. Now, this is the date of the publication of the Introduction to Metaphysics, and let's note here that we are 20 years beyond the time where he gave this scandalous speech, and we're only 2 years past the point where he's been allowed to return to the university and teach. And so, this passage, this is the most controversial. These are some of the most controversial. Well, this is the most controversial passage in the Introduction to Metaphysics, and it should all give us pause, because it seems to be here Heidegger not having much recanted. Let's see what he says. He says, "What is peddled about nowadays is the philosophy of National Socialism." This is the Nazi movement, but which has not the least to do with the inner truth and greatness of this movement, namely the encounter between global technology and humanity, is fishing in the troubled waters of values and totalities. Well, there was a lot of controversy about this. Jürgen Habermas, not long after this was published, who was a former student of Heidegger's, was scandalized by this, and he wrote a letter, complaining, how asking the question, how could he, even now, after everything that had happened, the death camps had been discovered. So how could this statement be allowed to remain in this text? And there was some, the editor did some fancy footwork, and Heidegger did some fancy footwork. Neither of their responses were particularly convincing, so because they didn't really, Heidegger, I can't remember exactly what he said, but something about, it was something, vague, and it didn't really change much of anything. And so that there we can, I want to draw that to your attention, as this was, even though he's going to say it was my bêtise to be affiliated with the Nazi party, in the 30s. This was long after. This was long after this when this paragraph was written. Okay, so Habermas too. By the way, he's still alive. Wonderful thinker. I would really urge you to read his work. He's a part of the Frankfurt School. You can see there I mentioned some names. The Frankfurt School: Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse. Jürgen Habermas was sort of on the younger tail end of that, but they, during the Second World War, many of these figures, with the exception of Benjamin, who was trying to escape Europe and ended up committing suicide in fear that he'd end up in a death camp because he was Jewish, they ended up in Southern California, where they stayed until they returned to Germany after the war. So these are all thinkers that are really worth investigating very carefully. Okay. Now, I draw your attention also to Hannah Arendt, who lived from 1906 to 1975, very famous author of The Origins of Totalitarianism, Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Human Condition, The Jewess Price. She was herself Jewish. She was Heidegger's lover. He thought of her as the love of his life. Hannah Arendt said there are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking itself is dangerous. Okay, now Heidegger was married. They had a kind of, his wife and him had an open marriage, and so he was very fond of Hannah Arendt, and it just, again, it doesn't exonerate him just because he has a Jewish girlfriend doesn't mean that he's not anti-Semitic. Obviously, that would be preposterous, but it does draw our attention to the the historical complexities of the time. And she she didn't defend his affiliation with the Nazi Party, but she did defend his thinking, she was very critical of it because of the Frankfurt School theorists and their, what she thought of as their sort of dialectical subtleties and their attacks on Heidegger, because they were like, Adorno wrote a book, for instance, called The Jargon of Authenticity, which was a rant against Heidegger. And so, Hannah Arendt remained somewhat loyal to Heidegger while, and Karl Jaspers, both of them were friends of his, but he, without excusing his what he had done during the time of that period. Okay, here is what Heidegger says in 1953, again in the Introduction to Metaphysics. What I said in my inaugural address in 1929 about the German university still applies today. The regions of science lie far asunder. Their ways of handling their subject matters are fundamentally different. The disintegrated multiplicity of disciplines is still meaningfully maintained today only through the technical organizations of the universities and faculties and through the practical aims of the disciplines. Yet, the rootedness of the sciences and their essential ground has atrophied. In all areas today, science is a technical matter of gathering information and communicating it. No awakening of the spirit at all can proceed from it as science. Science itself still needs awakening. All right, so there's a reaffirmation again of this notion that science needs awakening. But I put there in quotation, I put there in italics, I mean the idea that no awakening can happen unless it proceeds from spirit. And so spirit, this is this question. Well, what do we mean by spirit? What is spirit in this approach? Okay. Well, what is spirit for Heidegger? Here we find in Introduction to Metaphysics him linking it with the poetic. Only poetry is of the same order as philosophical thinking, although thinking and poetry are not identical. Talking about nothing remains forever an abomination and an absurdity for science, but aside from the philosopher, the poet can also talk about nothing. An essential superiority of the spirit holds sway in poetry. Because of this superiority, the poet always speaks as if beings were expressed and addressed for the first time. And he does, Heidegger does draw attention to the way in which the poetic precedes philosophy. And this is a theme, like for instance, the Iliad comes before, Plato. And this is also a kind of a theme that we find in the writings of Derrida as well. This notion that that philosophers are just a sorry lot of poets, and that finally perhaps it's the poetic to which we should attend. Well, as I've said, we're reading these philosophical texts as literature, and so I find myself there to be some truth to this. Okay. All right. Here's again from Introduction to Metaphysics. He said, here's Heidegger. Nietzsche calls the highest concept, such as being, the final wisp of evaporating reality. All right. And that's a really important quote. He spends a lot of time on this in the beginning pages of Introduction to Metaphysics, this notion of being, what Nietzsche is going to call being a vapor and a mere error. It is being a vapor. Now, what would a vapor be? And we can think here again, the idea of the vapor, the wisp, vaporous wisp, as being a matter of spirit, because spirit is a matter of wind. It's a matter of breath. It's a matter of fluid, literally of the body, a fluid that is aspirated. And so when we say, is being just a word? Is it just a vapor? Is it just a wisp? This would imply that being is also a matter of spirit, because spirit, it is precisely spirit that is a wisp or a vapor. Okay, and this is why Heidegger jumps onto this. Okay, and he's very critical of Nietzsche for making this observation. This is going to be linked to his criticism of Nietzsche as a more nihilistic aspect of Nietzsche's thinking here. Here's Heidegger. What Nietzsche says here about being is no casual remark. It is his guiding conception of being since the earliest days of his philosophical labor. Being a vapor, an error? If this is so, then the only possible conclusion is that we should also give up the question, why are there beings as such and as a whole instead of nothing? For what is the point of the question anymore if what it puts into question is just a vapor and an error? Does Nietzsche speak the truth, or is he himself the final victim of a long-standing errancy and neglect? The question, is being a mere word and its meaning a vapor, or is it the spiritual fate of the West? Okay. Now, even though Heidegger poses this as a question, Heidegger is disagreeing with Nietzsche that being is not a mere vapor. In fact, that the spiritual fate of the very West, of the world itself, hinges on this vapor. Okay, so and the vapor, as we said, is a matter of spirit. Okay, so a spirit again is really at the center of the questions that he is asking here, and he's saying in effect that the entire fate of the world, hinges on a vapor, which is to say, on the question of spirit, this matter of spirit, okay, or which is literally fluid expectorated from the body. When the farthest corner of the globe has been conquered technologically and can be exploited economically, there still looms like a specter, there's an interesting apparition of the specter, over all this uproar the question, what for, where to, and what then? The spiritual decline of the earth has progressed so far that peoples are in danger of losing their last spiritual strength, the strength that makes it possible even to see the decline now underway and to appraise it as such. All right, very, very strong words that we are in such a state, and this was, of course, written in 1953. Fast forward almost 70 years later, we are in such a state of decline that we don't even see anymore the decline. We don't even recognize it anymore because it's become completely normalized. And this is the feeling. This is the problem that he sees himself addressing, and that he sees spirit as holding a kind of a salvational possible solution to. Okay. The great decision regarding Europe is not to go down the path of annihilation. Precisely then can this decision come about only through the development of new historically, and note their spiritual forces from the center. And I want you to remember this, because we're going to look at some of the writings of, when we look at a fascist articulation of what fascism is, and we're going to see in a very similar way this idea of spiritual renewal coming from fascism and being salvational in this sense it's precisely at the center of much fascist thought. Is being a mere word and its meaning a vapor, or does what is named with the word being hold within it the spiritual fate of the West? And we know what Heidegger thinks about this. Indeed, it does hold the spiritual fate of the West. In this questioning, our Dasein, our being here in the world, as beings in the world, is summoned to its history and called to make a decision. All right, so there's some praxis for you. And this is, again, an introduction to metaphysics. Long after the fall of, after Hitler, kills himself, Mussolini is shot, like a dog, and and yet that Heidegger says we are summoned nonetheless to make a kind of a decision. So one might ask, well, what is the nature of this decision? But it remains, it certainly remains relevant. And we know that the decision that he made, 20 years earlier was not the correct decision by his own admission. The onslaught of that which aggressively destroys all rank and all that is world spiritual is what we call the demonic. There are many omens of the arising of this demonism, in unison with the growing perplexity and uncertainty of Europe against itself and with itself. One such omen is the disempowering of the spirit in the sense of misinterpretation. Okay, let me pause there for a minute, because the demonic here does not mean, as we discussed in a previous essay when we link this idea to the modality of being. This is a stigmatized term in this context, because what he's talking about is the position of the perceiving subject in the posture of certainty that makes the assertion, asserts the thesis, and then asserts it, and it becomes a kind of a vicious circuit. And this is linked to his critique, say, of Nietzsche as nihilist as well, when Nietzsche says that it doesn't matter what is true, it's just that you hold something to be true. That's what he sees as being Cartesian in Nietzsche. And this is what he's calling this sort of demonism, like the growing menace of those who no longer investigate, even begin to think about the question of the grounds of their claims to truth, but are certain, absolutely certain, that they stand in a position of truth. And then certainty becomes a kind of a demonic circulation of spirit reinforcing itself. And it's a circle, but it's a vicious circle, one that leaves no opening within it, because one doesn't, if you're in the presence of the man of truth, there's no point in asking questions. The truth has already been discovered. He says, for instance, as an example he's giving of the misinterpretation of spirit, is spirit as intelligence. This is what he's going to see as being problematic about Marxism. It interprets spirit as intelligence, and this as mere astuteness in the examination, calculation, and I'm putting here for clarification, subject-object observation of given things. Spirit, thus falsified as intelligence, is thereby reduced to a tool in the service of something else, a tool whose handling can be taught and learned. Okay, so this is a concept of spirit, but it's a false concept of spirit, and it's not what he means, which is more akin to the poetic, spirit, as in like Shelley's idea of the poets being the unacknowledged legislatures of the world. I think that was Shelley, maybe it was Keats, but it's the same idea. Poets are the unacknowledged legislatures of the world, and so it's a valorized concept of the poetic as spirit, and this would be the kind of spirit that he's valorizing in his talk, or in his discussion. All right, I want to turn our attention now to a text that Nietzsche wrote as a very young man, that was originally titled "The Future of Our Educational Systems." It's recently been retranslated as "Anti-Education." And this was Nietzsche at about the age of 24, I believe, who was still teaching in the university, This was the Nietzsche before Nietzsche left the university, walked away from the university. But he's a young man who's thinking about his position within the university, and he's thinking about the university, and he too is going to place spirit at the center of his concerns. All right. Now, we're going to see here. I'm also, because this is a meditation on spirit, which we're going to see. Much of what Nietzsche says is echoed in what Heidegger says much later, and so we're gonna. It's worth looking at for that reason. But also, we're going to see when we read Derrida's Ear of the Other that Derrida is going to also do a deconstructive reading of this little book that Nietzsche wrote as a very young man. And, and so we will return to some of these same ideas that we're going to see here in Nietzsche's essay when we look at Derrida's The Ear of the Other. Okay, so here's Nietzsche in this little book that he wrote as a young man. One must know how to find this German spirit in all its hiding places, whether under fashionable cloaks or heaps of rubble. All the more firmly do I cling to the German spirit as revealed in the German Reformation. There's Luther again. And in German music, you might think here of Wagner, to whom Nietzsche dedicated The Birth of Tragedy, and which in the tremendous courage and rigor of German philosophy and the recently tested loyalty of the German soldier has shown proof of that lasting strength, averse to all false appearance. A true purification and renewal of German education can proceed only from a deep and violent purification and renewal of the German spirit. Okay, so here we see Nietzsche saying something very similar to what we see Heidegger saying, what he says in his scandalous rectoral address, although without the reference to blood, and in the introduction to metaphysics, that there needs to be a spiritual renewal that is conceptualized in expressly German terms. Now let's note here that there was, and this passed into the Nazi ideology as well. This view that that the German language and that the German people were somehow connected in their thinking, in their culture, their folk culture, to Hellenic civilization, and whereas, let's say, France, Spain, Italy would be more connected to to Rome and to this sort of falsification, as we said, of in the last lecture, of philosophy that we get from the Greeks. And so there's a sense in which the German language itself is inherently for Nietzsche and for Heidegger, better able to to appropriate the sort of the lost truths of Hellenic civilization. And this does pass into Nazi ideology. I'll give you one instance of this. If you look at some of the Nazi propaganda films, was it Leni Riefenstahl who did Triumph of the Will, but she also did a documentary on the Olympics, and it's funny to watch. You can find it on YouTube, but it starts out with all these beautiful Greek statues, that are these nude statues like we find often in Greek, in antiquity, and then it shifts to Germans, preparing for the Olympics that were held in Berlin and during the Hitler period, and the clear cut between the statues of the Greeks and the bodies of the German athletes gives some indication to this kind of mythical notion of a kind of continuity between the ancient Greeks and the contemporary German people, which was being celebrated in that film, but also we find Nietzsche sort of making reference to in this essay. Remember, Nietzsche was trained in philology, which is study of the classics of Greek antiquity. So there's the renewal, the return to Greece is then linked in this sort of spiritual quest. The return to looking back at the Greeks, at the Hellenes, is linked to the desire to renew the German spirit. Okay. The link between, this is Nietzsche, the link between the innermost essence of the German and the genius of the Greek is a mysterious bond, extremely difficult to grasp. But until the true German spirit, in its noblest and uttermost need, reaches out for the saving hand of Greek genius, our educational institutions' goal of classical education will flutter about in the air, untethered to anything. Okay, so you see, I mean, Heidegger didn't have to learn this from Nietzsche. This was sort of in the air, but here we find Nietzsche with a very explicit articulation of these notions. Here's Nietzsche again. I want to note here too. So why this book? Why the new translators of this book entitled it "Anti-Education"? It's probably to sell the book, too, but also because he's not anti-education. He's anti a certain kind of education. He's anti-democratic education. The belief that education should be for the many, and he's asking, do we need all these colleges? Do we need all these teachers? Maybe we should only have education for the few, for the truly gifted. Now, in the liberal democratic context, that's a pretty scandalous notion. But that's really what he's saying, is that we have too many schools. There's only so many people that really have the ability to learn, and so maybe we should just focus on maybe our schools should be more elite than they are in these democratic liberal democratic institutions that were emerging at the time that Nietzsche wrote this, particularly as influenced by Kant. And so, anyway, let's continue. Too many people with no true calling end up as teachers. We must proclaim with one voice that people truly destined by nature for an educational path are infinitely few and far between, and that far fewer institutions of higher education than we have today would be enough to let these rare people develop successfully. In today's educational institutions intended for the masses, precisely the people for whom such institutions exist are the ones who receive the least support. Education for the masses cannot be our goal. Only the cultivation of the chosen individual equipped to produce great and lasting works. And I'll note here that in Nietzsche's little story, it's a kind of a parable. These students, they go out into the country and they want to shoot pistols, and they're partying, with their friends out in the country. These are young university students, and they come upon a philosopher who gives them these nuggets of wisdom about that they absorb from him. And so Nietzsche puts many of these ideas into the mouthpiece of this old philosopher. But the philosopher at the end of the story, he doesn't want students. He is, why are these noisy students? What are they doing? Troubling my repose. So it's like instead of this is a very different idea than the educational system being a system that should try to attract the most people as possible. Like the old philosopher in Nietzsche's view wants to attract very few people, only people who are really capable of learning. But now remember that Nietzsche himself, not long after he wrote this little controversial essay, walked away from the university, and he ended up writing most of his philosophy from a hotel in Turin, Italy. So he was not he became so disenchanted with the university as an institution that he just kind of washed his hands of it altogether. Okay. All right. Like a prince in exile, the German spirit is viewed with indifference and scorn by an educational system wallowing in state sponsorship. This spirit is a stranger, okay, same spirit that Heidegger's alluding to, in effect, wandering past in solitary grief. Why does the state need such a surplus of educational institutions and teachers? Remember, too, Heidegger, as I said, one of the first things he did was dismiss a lot of the philosophy faculty when he became rector at Freiburg. Why promote national education and popular enlightenment on such scale? Because the genuine German spirit is so hated because they fear the aristocratic nature of true education and culture, because they want to avoid the hard and rigorous discipline of the great leader and convince the masses that they can find the paths themselves under the guiding star of the state. Now let's pause here for a moment on the discipline of the great leader. Now note this is long before the time of Adolf Hitler, but the word that he uses is Führer, The leader is a Führer who's going to show the way, lead the path. And so this sort of thinking of a Führer in Germany itself, but what Heidegger, for instance, as the philosopher of the German university, sort of wants in a similar way to think of himself as that Führer, as that great leader. Now, this is, it would be silly to suggest that there are no echoes of there aren't parallels in any case between this kind of thinking and what emerges in the Third Reich. Now Nietzsche's going to say very famously, I know that after I die, something monstrous is going to be done in my name. And the Nazis, when they put out their annotated, edited version, abridged version of Nietzsche's philosophy as sort of the philosophy of the state, was one that was very selective, much like what happened in the Soviet Union, where there were texts by Marx you simply couldn't read because they were not allowed. The party wouldn't allow you to read them. So in a similar way, it was a very selective, Nietzsche, and so there's no, Derrida is going to address this in Ear of the Other. They said, we could say, Nietzsche would have vomited this ideology up. I mean, well, we don't know, but we can clearly see that there. I mean, it's just not honest to say that there aren't these kinds of echoes in between these different discourses. Okay, one thing consoles me, Nietzsche says, the German spirit, embattled as it is, and for which they have substituted such a gaudy stand-in. This spirit is brave. It will fight its way to a pure age and save itself. Okay, think about that when you hear Heidegger make this same claim that it will be the spirit that will redeem in the end. Okay, now again, as I said previously, I don't want to just assume we know what fascism is, because oftentimes we don't. These texts by these figures are they're controversial, and they're very disturbing in many cases, particularly the writings of Hitler. But we have to know what they are. We have to know what fascism is if we're going to even understand some of these questions that we're addressing. And so I just draw your attention here. There's Mussolini on the left. As you can see, he died in 1945, same year as Hitler. In fact, he was shot 3 days before Hitler killed himself. He was executed. And then the figure in the middle, Giovanni Gentile, he was also, assassinated. Was really, I mean, there's a book on fascism that is attributed to Mussolini. In fact, most of it was written by Gentile, and so Mussolini was not as he was a little brighter than Hitler, but not much. And Gentile is his thought is a fascist, but it's not a lunatic ranting. There is a kind of a inner core and coherence to it that's useful to examine and getting a sense of what fascism actually is. And so I'll say here it's written by Mussolini Gentile, or maybe the Gentile Mussolini, however you want to phrase it, published in 1932. And here we have a kind of cataloging of some of the key concepts of fascism. So let's just take a brief moment and look at them. He's going to say, many of the practical expressions of fascism can only be understood when considered in relation to its general attitude toward life, which is a spiritual attitude. Okay, there we have it again. And every time this word pops up, I'm going to put it in italics. Fascism is founded on duty, a life free from the limitations of time and space, in which the individual, by self-sacrifice, the renunciation of self-interest, by death itself, can achieve that purely spiritual existence in which his value as a man consists. The conception then of fascism is therefore a spiritual one. It's a spiritual one arising from the general reaction of the century, early part of the 20th century, against the flaccid materialistic positivism of the 19th century. This idea of these are hard men thinking hard thoughts. You find that in Chomsky as well. He likes to talk about he's doing hard science, as opposed to the I guess the flaccid humanist. So he's here, castigating his philosophical rivals as lacking in hardness. Okay, life as conceived by the fascists is serious, austere, religious. All its manifestations are poised in a world sustained by moral forces and subject to spiritual responsibilities. The fascist disdains an easy life. The fascist conception of life is a religious one in which man is viewed in his immanent relation to a higher law, endowed with an objective will transcending the individual and raising him to conscious membership of a spiritual society. Man is man only by virtue of the spiritual process to which he contributes as a member of the family, the social group, the nation, and in function of history to which all nations bring their contribution. Fascism does not believe in the possibility of happiness on earth conceived of by the economist literature of the 18th century, and it therefore rejects the teleological notion that at some future time the human family will secure a final settlement of all its difficulties. This notion runs counter to experience, which teaches that life is in continual flux and in process of evolution. In politics, fascism aims at realism. Okay, let's pause there for just a minute because we've discussed in a previous lecture this idea of progress through conflict that we see in Kant, Hegel, Marx. This teleological notion that war, as terrible as it may be, is leading us somewhere, and where it's leading us is a good place. All right, to perhaps an idea of eternal peace, which Rousseau begins to think about, and which Kant develops from his thinking on Rousseau, which then becomes, basis of, League of Nations and later the UN. This idea that we can reach a place at the end of history. Derrida is going to return to this. Is important to remember when you read Spectres of Marx. Derrida is going to return to this in Spectres of Marx, and when he thinks of Marx and Hegel as offering teleologies, much like the Abrahamic, the Messianisms in the Abrahamic traditions as well. So, but Mussolini, Gentile, is saying here, we're not teleological. Life is struggle, life is confrontation. There's no the confrontation never ends. There's no end of history in the way that Marx dreams. Marx too, but Kant dreams of in his essay to eternal peace. So it's a direct repudiation of that notion. And also, I want to underscore here again, fascism aiming at realism. Okay, the architect of realism in even in today, in determining U.S. foreign policy, for instance, which is also realism. We say, well, if fascism aims at realism, then we could say if realism is a kind of fascism in its international policies towards other nations, well, the United States has had a realist foreign policy for a very long time, since World War II, in many ways influenced by the thinking of Carl Schmitt, who we're going to look at, who's also a Nazi. But particularly, we see this strain running through figures like Hens, Morgenthau, Henry Kissinger. It's the official whether you're on the left or the right, historically, since World War II, U.S. foreign policy has been a policy predicated on what Mussolini, Giovanni Gentile here is calling realism. Okay, anti-individualistic, the fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state. It is opposed to classical liberalism. Liberalism denied the state in the name of the individual. Fascism reasserts the rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state interprets, develops, and potentiates the whole life of a people. The fascist state, as a higher and more spiritual expression of personality, is a force, but a spiritual force. Okay, such a conception of life makes fascism the resolute negation of the doctrine underlying the so-called scientific and Marxian socialism, the doctrine of historical materialism, which would explain the history of mankind in terms of class struggle and by changes in the processes and instruments of production, say modes of production, to the exclusion of all else. Fascism denies the equation well-being equals happiness, which sees in men mere animals, content when they can feed and fatten, thus reducing them to a vegetative existence, pure and simple. Okay, there is, again, if Dasein is a Dasein of spirit, and the spirit is what is also differentiating of man from the animals, or Dasein from animals, here we find a similar kind of equation in the thinking of Gentile Mussolini. Okay, now I'm going to take a moment and just go over very quickly this kind of notion that we find in Heraclitus, which is also cited in Heidegger's The Introduction to Metaphysics, this saying of Heraclitus that war is the father of all things. And we've seen how Heidegger, that confrontation being linked to this idea of concealment and unconcealment in our discussion of Heidegger and Truth is linked to the idea of truth emerges from struggle, from conflict, from polemos. Polemos, even at one point, Heidegger says, is logos. This is not this is a celebrated concept of war as being, or as linked to this idea in Heidegger of conflict as being essential to truth's disclosure. But here we find this is still the Gentile Mussolini. He says, as regards the future development of mankind, fascism does not, generally speaking, believe in the possibility or utility of perpetual peace. Well, there it is, straight up rejection of Kant. It therefore discards pacifism as a cloak for cowardly supine renunciation in contradistinction to self-sacrifice. War alone keys up all human energies to their maximum tension and sets the seal of nobility on those peoples who have the courage to face it. Okay? So there's a celebration straight up of war, that kind of Achilles-like, struggle for, recognition, but not because it's a matter of historical progress, which will lead us to a time when when conflicts will no longer be necessary, but more simply as a valorized concept of war, which makes us noble because we have to, almost in a straight up Hegelian way, sort of, confront will show contempt for life in the face of death and become individuated on the basis of overcoming our fear of death. Okay, here's Heidegger. Here's Heraclitus. This is again at the top. I have a more conventional translation of this passage in Heraclitus. War is the father of all things, and our father of all, and the king of all, and it has shown some as gods and others as human beings, made some slaves and others free. Okay. Now Heidegger translates this as confrontation is indeed for all that comes to presence, the sire who lets emerge, but also for all the preserver that holds sway. For it lets some appear as gods, others as human beings. Some it produces or sets forth as slaves, but others as the free. Okay. Now this is cited in the Introduction to Metaphysics, paragraph number 47. He also, when Carl Schmitt, during the time when Heidegger was rector at Freiburg, when Carl Schmitt came onto the faculty, he gave him one of his books, and he inscribed this saying from Heraclitus on the book, which was kind of an emblematic affirmation of Schmitt's realism. Okay, so here's Heidegger's gloss on Heraclitus, or how he interprets this particular saying of Heraclitus, this fragment. The polemos named here is a strife that holds sway before everything divine and human. But it's not war in the human sense for Heidegger, and that does differentiate him from that more explicit articulation that we just found in the Mussolini Gentile text. As Heraclitus thinks it, struggle first and foremost allows what essentially unfolds to step apart in opposition. First allows position and status and rank to establish themselves in coming to presence. In confrontation, world comes to be. Confrontation does not divide unity, much less destroy it. It builds unity. It is the gathering logos. Polemos and logos are the same. Okay. Now I want to very briefly, I just said this very quickly. We're coming to the end of our lecture, but I want to very quickly just look at a little passage from Hitler. And I want to again underscore what we saw in that previous lecture from Heidegger, that scandalous lecture when he became the rector at Freiburg, and the reference to blood, because unlike that Mussolini Gentile text that we just read, the thinking of Hitler is just like I said, it's like looking at vomit. It's just like all over the place, and the guy just rants and rants, and it's this lunatic madness. But there is a theme that runs through it, and it's this theme of Aryan blood. Okay, so I picked out a passage from Mein Kampf, Hitler's book My Struggle or Mein Kampf, which is because we're here in the United States, and this will give you some indication of what Hitler thought about North America in the time that he wrote this book. He says, okay, there are numberless examples in history showing with terrible clarity how each time Aryan blood has become mixed with that of inferior peoples, the result has been an end of the culture-sustaining race. Remember, he thinks of himself as an Aryan. North America, the population of which consists for the most part Germanic elements, which mix very little with inferior colored nations, displays humanity and culture very differently from that of Central and South America, in which the settlers, mainly of Latin in origin, mingled their blood very freely with that of the Aborigines. So he's congratulating white Americans first for their Aryan German blood, but also for their racism, since they didn't mingle in the way that the Latin conquerors of Central and South America mingled with native populations. So this is for him. This is why America was great, and for those of us who want to make America great again, there you sort of see where the basis of this ideology comes from. Okay, taking the above as an example, we clearly recognize the elements or the effects of racial intermixture. All right, if you take North America versus South and Central America, and the presumption being North America is so much superior. The man of Germanic race on the continent of America, having kept himself pure and unmixed, has risen to be its master, and he will remain master so long as he does not fall into the shame of mixing the blood. Okay, well, there you have it. There's the Hitlerian view, and the point I want to make here as we conclude is if spirit is a wind, but it's also in elemental terms a kind of a fluid of the body too. This question of spirit, it might have some link or connection to the question of blood. And it's just something I'd like you to kind of think about a bit. The question I'm raising here is, what is spirit in Heidegger and Derrida? If spirit is not a transcendental concept, or something that Derrida is going to say in Spectres of Marx is anything but immaterial, which means it's not a metaphysical concept in Derrida's articulation of it, to what extent is spirit in Heidegger and Derrida a matter of blood or of bodily fluids? If it is, if all philosophies are philosophies embodiment, what concept of the body do we find in the thought of Derrida? Now, we've talked about the Dasein in Heidegger. Well, what is it? And we said all philosophies are philosophies of embodiment. What is the thinking of the body that we find in Derrida? This is something to kind of keep in the back of your mind as we read the text of Derrida. Now, given the unavoidable fact that Heidegger was a Nazi, to what extent does his affiliation with Nazism vitiate or spoil his philosophy? Should we therefore simply not read Heidegger? Again, I don't want to propose an answer to that question or suggest to you what the right answer is. But I think that's the right question in any case. And it's one that I hope that you'll wrestle with more in the coming days.